What if the safest dream a nation ever sold was built on sand? Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's event story, we travel to the years when Americans believed the key to security could be signed for, upgraded, and cashed out every summer. When prices only seemed to move in one direction. When neighbors congratulated each other for owning the same future. Then, quietly, the ground beneath all that confidence began to shift. People said it was simple. Buy a house, let time do the work. If you needed cash, the house would lend it back to you. If you needed status, the house would speak for you. If you needed proof you were going somewhere, the house sat there like a certificate on the lawn. It looked like common sense. It felt like progress. It became a story so many told themselves that nobody questioned whether they still believed it, or only feared what would happen if they stopped. Lisa worked in Las Vegas. She learned to measure months by escrow closings and weekends by open houses. She got good at pacing her voice, at placing her fingers lightly on a kitchen island and saying, "This is where the holidays will feel different." Buyers nodded. Some brought parents who took photos in living rooms they didn't own yet. Everyone said the same thing in different words. It's going up. It always has. It always will. Michael watched numbers for a living in a midtown office where the city never slept and the screens never blinked. He was good with patterns. He knew how lines moved when people agreed about the future. He told himself he wasn't betting. He was balancing. A little here, a little there, and the risk, if it still existed, would be spread so thin that no single failure could hurt the whole. He liked the sound of that thought, even when it kept him at his desk until midnight. Tom ran a small bank in Ohio. He liked the way customers leaned on the counter to talk. He liked knowing their kids' names, their wedding dates, the years they planned to retire. He didn't see himself as a gatekeeper. He saw himself as a helper, the person who turned desire into paperwork and paperwork into keys. When people cried at the closing table, it confirmed what he'd always believed. A home makes life heavier in the best way. There were warning lights, but they looked like decorations in those years. Houses doubled in value for no one's clear reason. Young waiters bought condos. Teachers talked about flipping. College friends bragged they'd never pay rent again. A neighbor took a second loan to remodel the kitchen, then a third to refinish the backyard, and spoke about it like he'd outsmarted arithmetic. On television, commentators wore smiles and called it healthy. In speeches, officials praised homeownership as proof the system worked for everyone. The country didn't just believe in property, it believed property was a promise. And promises, once bought by millions, are hard to return without starting a fight. If a single doubt pressed against that optimism, it was faint, like wind tapping glass in a well-lit room. Someone asked what would happen if prices flattened. The answer came wrapped in laughter. That can't happen here. Another person wondered how much debt a person could carry before the numbers started to protest. The answer was polished. The market is bigger than any one borrower. Everyone agreed the worst thing you could do to a story like this was interrupt it. So nobody did. Lisa stopped keeping a pen behind her ear because she started keeping two. Michael started leaving an extra jacket on the back of his chair for mornings that turned unexpectedly into nights. Tom practiced softening his voice when he read monthly payments out loud so the numbers sounded friendly. And the country, full of lawns and cul-de-sacs and confidence, decided the future could be scheduled on the first of every month for 30 years. But every plan has a shadow, even if it's hard to see in bright weather. The first shadow here was small. A house didn't sell on time. A buyer asked for a different rate. A payment somewhere arrived late and sat quietly in a pile the world hadn't learned to fear. Then, a second payment did the same thing. If you were listening closely, you might have heard it, the soft knock of tomorrow asking for what it was promised. No one noticed, not yet. And even those who did told themselves another story to calm the first one. It's a pause, not a turn. Besides, the charts still pointed up. But every dream borrowed from tomorrow expects to be repaid. The question, as always, is when. And what it will cost when the bill finally arrives. Before a crash has a sound, it has a silence. In 2005, that silence looked like a for sale sign that failed to move in the summer heat. It looked like a voicemail that didn't return a call. It looked like 3 people who promised to show up and 2 who forgot. It wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in a way that worried the people who lived by momentum. Lisa didn't admit she felt it at first. She kept champagne in the office mini fridge for weekend showings and wore the shoes that made confidence look easy. But when a builder asked if she could get creative to move a row of identical homes, something taut inside her pulled. She did get creative. She threw in backyard furniture and a gift card. The house still didn't move. She called her favorite lender. He said they were tightening a few things. She laughed and said, "Since when do you guys tighten?" He said, "Since now." Michael saw it in the 8th decimal place where fatigue hides. He ran a sheet again. The line didn't curve the way it used to. His boss told him to adjust assumptions. He did. The screen obeyed, but the shape felt wrong, like a smile held too long. After hours, he watched footage of home prices in places that didn't used to make the national news. Florida, inland California, certain corners of Nevada. Reporters used phrases like cooling and softening. He tried to decide if those words comforted him, or only explained how to worry with nicer syllables. Tom got a memo from head office with a line that made his stomach tighten. "Please implement revised standards immediately." He carried the paper to his window and watched the street where he'd grown up. He knew the porches, the noises, the pets. He knew the way these houses swallowed sorrow during winters and released it back as relief every spring. He knew people were counting on him to behave like a bank and like a neighbor at the same time. The memo had no space for neighbor. It had short bullet points and a tone he'd never heard in writing before. Braced. By summer, the silences had multiplied. Lisa's open houses grew lonelier. Michael's morning dashboards showed tiny red signals, not large enough to trigger alarms, but too consistent to ignore. Tom's branch said no more often than yes, and learned how a person's face changes when a door is shut politely. Television tried to translate it. Concerns, they said. Headwinds. Another word walked into the conversation like an uninvited guest. Subprime. The country learned to say it, then to say it louder, then to say it like an accusation. It didn't matter that most people couldn't define it. Words can do harm without full definitions. People heard it and decided it meant someone else's mistake might not stay someone else's for long. The first business to fall wasn't famous enough to scare anyone but the few who worked there. It closed in a sentence. Reporters called it contained. Contained is what people say when they're still hoping a fire can be solved with a window fan. Lisa told herself autumn was always slow. Michael told himself variance was normal. Tom told himself patience was part of the job. They wanted to be right. They needed to be right. But the numbers didn't flinch when people believed in them harder. They went where pressure sent them. He didn't know it yet. None of them did. But somewhere, a stack of files was being prepared for a courier flight across the country. The files had the smell of paper that's been touched too often and folded too many times. Inside were stories told in boxes with check marks and letters that meant risk or didn't. On another morning in another year, the stack would have been tall and boring. On this morning, it would be heavy. The person who signed for it would realize 2 things: what it contained and what it didn't. In March 2007, the morning news decided to speak more plainly. Lisa woke to a headline in her inbox: price reduction. It was one of her favorite houses, the couple with the long Sunday lunches and the dog that slept in the laundry room. They were smiling in every photo in the listing. Their smile was now a percentage number, with a minus sign in front of it. She drove by and didn't park. You can care for people and still not be able to knock when there's nothing you can do. The lawn had gone from green to uncertain. She took a breath and promised herself one more weekend would fix it. That was the trick of those months. Promises as anesthetic. Michael sat in a conference room where the lights buzzed louder than the conversation. A senior voice said, "liquidity," a lot, as if the word were a sponge that could soak up all the other words. People nodded at phrases that moved air, but not outcomes. Someone said the models didn't account for this much correlation. Another person said the models were fine, and reality would return to them if given time. When he left, Michael realized the meeting had given him the same feeling as watching a window during a storm. The view hadn't changed, but the glass now knew it was glass. Tom's tellers started seeing familiar faces twice in one day. First, to deposit a paycheck. Second, to ask if they could withdraw cash just in case. He began each conversation with the sentence he hoped would be true. Everything is fine. When he closed his office door, he looked at a sheet that listed late payments. He'd never been offended by late payments. He'd grown up in a town where winters were long and luck was short. But the pattern this time wasn't seasonal, it was structural. Rows of names that didn't used to share problems were now rhyming. Summer made the distance between events feel shorter. A fund that wasn't small enough to ignore stopped allowing withdrawals. A local lender shut offices and left a handful of pens and a potted plant behind. There were interviews on TV with people who said they'd seen it coming. Interviews are excellent places for hindsight. People spoke with certainty they hadn't possessed when it would have changed anything. Then, like someone dropping a glass in a crowded room, a name everyone recognized hit the floor. Bear Stearns. The story traveled faster than the facts. The building didn't burn. It withered. It was sold on a weekend like it was a car with a problem the seller didn't want to discuss. On Monday, employees carried cardboard boxes under the kind of sky that makes people think about metaphors. Michael watched their faces, then turned back to his screen and tried to decide what part of the future still belonged to prediction. Lisa recognized the name from a flyer she'd once seen in a lobby, and from a customer who had spoken it with pride. Now the same name looked like a knob she couldn't turn. That might open a door she didn't want to look through. She started waitressing at night. She told herself it was temporary. She said temporary like a charm. Tom read the write-up out loud in his morning huddle and paused at the price. A rounding error for a government. A lifetime for a family. He told his staff to be patient with customers and patient with themselves. He didn't say the quiet part, that patience has a cost, and the bank had begun to pay it. Panic doesn't start as a scream. It starts as a whisper repeated by too many people within earshot. Maybe I should sell. Maybe we should pull back. Maybe we should wait. The maybes pile up until the yeses have nowhere to sit. By autumn, Lisa sold her own house, at a loss to cover the others she couldn't move. She packed in silence and left a note for whoever climbed those steps next. May this place be kind to you. Michael lost a bonus, and then lost a division, and then, in the kind of administrative poetry that tells you exactly what matters, lost his building access on a Thursday. He didn't take a box. Boxes are for souvenirs. He didn't have any. Tom went to another foreclosure auction and recognized half the bidders by their winter coats. He thought about a wedding he'd attended the year before and how the same faces had been lit from within then. And still the largest sound, the one that would teach people how loud quiet can be, had not arrived. It was coming, though. The shape of it was already standing on the calendar. September 2008 arrived under a blue sky so clean it looked like denial. The city moved the way cities do, on schedules with coffees, with things to do and phones to check. The name most people had no reason to say before that month became a low drum everyone could feel. Lehman. Michael reached the building earlier than he needed to and still felt late. He tried his badge. It worked. He looked at the guard. The guard smiled in a way people smile when they don't know if they'll have this job next week. Upstairs, the monitors through red like a warning sign had learned how to glow. There were emails from people who never wrote emails. There were requests for updates on numbers that update themselves. He wrote a sentence in a draft and stared at it. How did we forget risk? He deleted it because the answer was too long for an email. Tom watched customers gather before opening, the way they used to when there was a holiday rush and a special promotion. Now the special was fear. He met each person's eyes, nodded toward the chairs, promised they had time. He believed that. He believed it harder than he believed almost anything else in those weeks. Belief can be an ethical responsibility in a role like his. It can also be a problem. Lisa folded a stack of listings and saw her own handwriting look like a stranger's. She knew the names on each one, not just the numbers. She knew which hallway a child had raced down. She knew which bookshelf had been built by a grandfather 70 years old who still smelled like cedar. She held the papers and understood something new. This wouldn't be like other slow seasons. This wasn't a season. That Sunday night, the footage lived on loop. Doors opening, people with boxes, faces people would pretend to recognize in interviews years later. An anchor said, "Historic," as if the syllables could offer shelter. Michael watched the sound drop out of the room. A colleague placed a hand on his shoulder, removed it, and walked away without speaking. There was nothing to say. A fact is a fact. Gravity works. The building emptied. The next morning, his badge did not beep. The guard raised a hand and lowered it with an apology in the motion. Systems shut off cleanly when they belong to computers. When they belong to people, they hang on in memory like a light left on in an empty house. He went home on foot. He'd always thought he would know what to carry if he ever had to leave in a hurry. It turned out knowledge wasn't helpful. Markets around the world reacted as if each had received the same message at the same time in the same voice. They tumbled. Credit, which had always flowed like the assumption behind every other assumption, moved like a tired thing. Banks measured each other with new caution. The distance between two institutions that had sat across from each other for decades suddenly looked like a cliff. On the street where Tom worked, the line bent around the block. He put out bottled water and asked one of his tellers to explain how the insurance limit worked, in a way that sounded like translation, not policy. He handed out deposit slips to people who had no deposits to make, and realized how much of banking is theater, even when it's honest. Lisa walked past two moving trucks on the same block and found herself rehearsing what she would say if someone asked her to help. She wanted to carry a box, and also to cry for no specific reason. The trucks were full of pots and blankets and photographs. People don't put money in trucks. They put their lives there. You could almost hear it when the trucks pulled away. The government spoke with the tone of a driver correcting a skid, calm, direct, busy, with hands out of view. Plans were announced that had numbers so large, they made ordinary arithmetic feel like a childhood memory. Everyone had an opinion about whether it was right. In kitchens and break rooms and lunch counters and high-rise offices, the country argued. Underneath those arguments, something older moved, asking whether a system still deserved trust after it had burned the people who fed it. Michael watched a brief rally on a small television in a diner where the coffee was mostly heat and the eggs were mostly salt. Prices went up for an hour, and then remembered why they had been going down. He felt tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. He called his mother to say he was fine. He used the word fine twice, then changed the subject because he didn't want to hear how his voice sounded. Weeks turned into a pattern that felt less like time and more like damage moving across a map. We gave this period a name, the Great Recession. Names make it possible to talk. They don't make it easier to live. Lisa found a part-time job, and then a second one. Michael sold his car and freed himself from a monthly reminder he no longer needed to see. Tom attended a board meeting where lawyers used sentences that stood so close together they blocked out the sun. The bank would be sold. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. He shook hands and felt something end. Something besides the bank. The headlines eventually moved on. They always do. People returned to work or learned to talk about not having it. Adjustable payments adjusted and kept adjusting. Some families moved in with other families. Some marriages learned how to hold more weight. Some people who had never asked for help learned to ask and discovered how to be grateful without apologizing. Microhook. We call this resilience in reports. People called it waking up and keeping their face steady while they tied their shoes. The system did what systems do when threatened. It found a floor and stood still until it felt brave enough to take a step. 2009 arrived with a kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the absence of alarms. The markets stopped falling hard. They started wobbling. Policies arrived dressed as medicine, whose side effects were going to be discussed later. Commentators debated whether the worst was over. The people who had lost jobs, homes, security, and some portion of the way they saw themselves knew the answer didn't matter. The damage had already happened. The question now was small and practical. What next? Lisa moved to a cheaper city and rented a small office on a street that wasn't trendy enough to pretend it was. She started managing rentals for people who had become accidental landlords. She learned the names of plumbers and the hours of electricians. She kept a ledger so neat, it looked like a prayer for order. Every signature felt heavier than the ones she used to collect because she knew now what signed papers can do to people. When a tenant fell behind, she asked questions before she read clauses. Michael found a job at a modest consulting firm where the coffee was free and the windows looked out onto a brick wall that changed color with the weather. He advised clients on risk as if risk were a person who might be persuaded to behave. He stopped saying clever phrases he had enjoyed saying in previous years. He learned how to end a meeting when it had reached the point where more words would only make everyone feel intelligent without making anyone safer. When a friend asked over dinner if it could happen again, he didn't flinch. Of course, we would give it a different name and tell a different story and promise that the lessons were permanent. And then we would do it anyway because people remain people. Tom took a position helping retirees plan. He drew pie charts in pencil and kept the eraser clean. He spoke slowly and used examples from the town so that the numbers would feel like something you could touch. He started telling people to measure success by sleep, not by returns. When a man across his desk asked if that was pessimism, Tom said no. It was optimism about mornings. The country declared in speeches that reforms would protect it next time. It wrote rules, it held hearings, it punished a few people and changed some forms and moved on. Under the paperwork, the older story remained. Growth is good, more is better, and tomorrow will be strong enough to carry anything we put on it. We had learned something, yes, but the learning had to balance with the instinct to forget pain. If people remembered everything, they would never drive again after a car accident. They would never love again after heartbreak. Forgetting is not only a flaw, it is a function. But when forgetting meets markets, the cycle wakes up. That is how recovery often begins. Not with triumph, but with a willingness to try again, while looking away from the parts that still ache. New ads returned to television that sounded like the old ones wearing new clothes. A voice promised ease, another promised access. You could almost believe nothing had happened if you wanted to badly enough. Invisible turnaround. And yet, in the places where the worst of it had landed, people developed small habits that were, if not wisdom, then maybe caution, a second set of eyes on paperwork, a question someone wouldn't have asked before, a pause before a signature. Lisa noticed the pause most. Buyers now asked about the fine print. Renters asked about the deposit with a kind of alertness that looked like dignity. She liked these questions because they sounded like people had decided to take care of themselves on purpose. Michael noticed it in boardrooms, when someone asked to see the downside case a second time. Tom noticed it when a client chose the plan with the smaller number and the steadier jaw. We didn't build less after all that. We built differently sometimes. We learned how to say risk out loud without lowering our voices. We wrote resilience in proposals and meant it half the time. The country moved forward, as it always does, not because it forgot everything, but because it remembered just enough. Recovery didn't look like celebration. It looked like breathing after holding your breath too long. Shops reopened with half the lights turned off to save power. Banks painted fresh logos over the same doors. Politicians called it a new beginning. Ordinary people called it getting by. Lisa's phone started ringing again. Small rentals, cautious buyers. She spoke slower now, never saying safe or guaranteed. Those words felt radioactive. She'd lost friends who couldn't crawl back from the debt they'd chased. She kept a list of names she meant to call one day when it no longer felt like reopening a wound. Michael kept spreadsheets tidy, but emotions minimal. When junior analysts spoke with certainty, he let silence answer. He'd learned certainty was just arrogance with better grammar. He missed the thrill of risk, but not the shame that followed it. Tom adjusted to quieter halls. Customers still asked for miracles. He offered math instead. Some smiled, some left. But he slept better. Everywhere, optimism tried to grow again. You could see it in small things. New coffee shops, job fairs, couples daring to look at listings. Hope returned, disguised as routine. But deeper down, in the machinery of markets, engineers were already designing new instruments, with different acronyms that promised to make everything safer. History doesn't repeat word for word. It rhymes until you stop listening. And that's how it begins again, softly, politely, under the sound of ordinary life. The crisis left scars invisible to balance sheets. Children who overheard parents arguing about payments learned to flinch at envelopes. Graduates entered a world that told them to dream, but charged interest on the dream before they earned it. Lisa volunteered at workshops teaching first-time buyers. She opened each session with a sentence that used to feel unthinkable. There are good reasons not to own a home. People listened because the word crash still echoed faintly in memory. Michael found himself drawn to lectures on behavioral finance, how emotion shapes markets. The subject felt like confession disguised as science. He took notes but knew the key lesson by heart. People forget faster than systems change. Tom watched new developers break ground on the outskirts of town. Billboards rose again, sleek fonts, familiar promises. He wanted to believe this time was different, but every engine hum reminded him of the one that seized before. Reporters wrote anniversaries, analysts wrote essays, politicians wrote memoirs, and then silence returned. Not as fear this time, but as boredom. Boredom is where complacency grows best. By 2013, prosperity was trending again. Unemployment down, markets up, analysts smiling on screens. Lisa caught herself almost believing the excitement. Then she met a couple who bragged about buying 3 houses to flip fast. She smiled, sold them paint samples, and drove home with the radio off. Michael's firm celebrated record profits. The bonus pool overflowed. He stood by the buffet table listening to coworkers toast innovation. He wondered whether the champagne was for surviving the storm or forgetting it. Tom retired that spring. At his farewell, colleagues thanked him for steady leadership. He thanked them for the chance to serve and left out what he really thought. That leadership sometimes means knowing when not to believe the crowd. That summer, television ran ads showing smiling families holding keys again. The soundtrack sounded familiar. The country had found its rhythm. But rhythm isn't the same as harmony. It just keeps time while lessons fade. A decade later, historians agreed it was the worst crisis since the Great Depression. They produced documentaries, charts, sound bites. Most ended with hope. Few mentioned Lisa, Michael, or Tom. Crashes rarely have main characters because the plot belongs to everyone. Lisa finally paid off the last loan tied to the years that broke her. She didn't throw a party. She bought new tires and kept receipts. Financial freedom, she'd learned, looks a lot like ordinary maintenance. Michael married, moved to a smaller apartment than he could afford, and found peace in predictability. He still read market news, but never traded for fun. When friends teased him for being cautious, he smiled and said, "Experience compounds too." Tom's garden grew thick with tomatoes. He liked watching something rise from soil instead of debt. When neighbors asked for advice about investments, he pointed to the plants. "Start here," he said. The crash had ended years ago, yet the quiet discipline it forced remained for some, like muscle memory after an injury. The nation's conversation shifted toward technology, politics, climate, anything but credit. But beneath new headlines, the same psychology pulsed, the need to believe in limitless growth. Lisa joined a community project, rebuilding foreclosed neighborhoods into affordable housing. One day, a volunteer asked, "Why do you care so much?" She paused. "Because I helped sell the fantasy once. Now I'd rather sell the truth." Michael taught interns about ethics in markets. He told them the story without naming himself. Some nodded solemnly. Others checked their phones. He knew which ones would repeat the cycle and which might slow it down. Tom watched from retirement as new financial products promised riskless yield. The words were different. The melody was the same. He whispered to himself, "Here we go again." Every system forgets its last warning eventually. The challenge isn't preventing greed. It's remembering humility long enough for wisdom to take root. Years pass. Memories thin. Children who were 10 during the crash now buy their first homes. They don't remember the panic, only the stories their parents told. Stories lose sharpness when retold in comfort. Lisa's office now trains young agents. When she hears them say guaranteed equity, she interrupts gently. Nothing is guaranteed except the paperwork that says you owe. They laugh, thinking she's exaggerating. She smiles. Let them learn. Experience is the teacher markets respect most. Michael receives invitations to panels on resilient capitalism. He sits under bright lights and answers questions that all sound the same. Could it happen again? Yes. Will it? Probably. Do we care? Not until it hurts. The audience applauds as if he'd said something comforting. Tom keeps a small folder labeled 2008 Notes. He rereads it once a year. It's not nostalgia, it's maintenance of memory. What did the housing bubble teach America? That prosperity without prudence is just a countdown. That optimism can be leveraged until it breaks. That systems fail less from ignorance than from incentive. But it also taught something gentler: survival. People found new ways to work, to share, to rebuild. Neighborhoods once silent with foreclosure signs slowly filled with laughter again. Lisa walked those streets years later and realized healing isn't about forgetting pain. It's about living beyond it. Michael mentored students who spoke of finance with hope instead of greed. Tom sat on his porch, listening to distant construction and thinking, maybe faith in tomorrow isn't foolish, if tomorrow remembers yesterday. In 2020, another global shock hit. A virus, not a mortgage. Markets fell, recovered, fell again. Lisa watched clients panic online and thought, it's always something different wearing the same disguise. Michael stayed calm. Liquidity is emotion, he told colleagues. When people breathe, markets breathe. Tom watched news reports from home, thankful his savings were small enough to understand. This time, governments acted faster. Lessons, half remembered, whispered from 2008. Move early, move big. It worked, mostly. The pattern remained: crisis, relief, reflection, forgetting. History didn't need villains anymore. It needed listeners. Every era believes its crash is the last. That's the illusion markets sell best. But behind each boom and bust lies something constant. People wanting to feel safe. Mortgages, stocks, tokens, whatever form trust takes. It's all the same prayer said in different languages. Lisa tells new agents, you're not selling property. You're selling belief. Handle it carefully. Michael tells young traders, risk isn't the enemy. Amnesia is. Tom tells his grandchildren, debt is a story you tell the future. Make sure the future wants to hear it. The bubble burst, the market healed, but the need to hope remained untouched. If you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of 2008 in everyday speech. Safe as houses, too big to fail. The market always recovers. They sound comforting because they simplify chaos. But comfort without comprehension is what got us here. Lisa sometimes drives past the lot where her biggest sale once stood. The house is gone, replaced by a park. Children play where contracts collapsed. She thinks that might be the best use of the land. Michael reads headlines about record-high home prices and size. Every generation thinks they're smarter than leverage, he murmurs. Tom closes his eyes and prays, not for prosperity, but for patience. What if the 2008 crisis wasn't just an economic correction, but a collective reminder of limits? What if the true asset we lost was trust, and the interest we still pay is anxiety? Markets recover, memories distort. But somewhere between the graphs and the grief lies the truth. Wealth is fragile because belief is. Lisa, Michael, and Tom never met. Yet their stories weave together like cautionary scripture for a secular age. Each thought they understood value. Each learned that value depends on perspective. The buyer's hope, the lender's faith, the regulator's restraint. When systems fail, they don't vanish, they reveal. And what they revealed in 2008 was simple and terrifying. We had mistaken momentum for meaning. Good evening again, and thank you for staying by the fire until the embers. Tonight's story wasn't about villains or victims. It was about belief, the fuel of every boom and every heartbreak. The housing bubble showed us that when confidence becomes currency, truth gets mortgaged. Yet it also showed resilience, families rebuilding, trust mending, lessons lingering in quieter hearts. Maybe the question isn't whether it will happen again. Maybe the question is whether next time we'll remember sooner. What would you have done in their place? Would you have sold the dream, built it, or warned against it? Do we recognize a blessing when it arrives late, or only after it costs us everything? Thank you for being part of our little fireside circle tonight. If this story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you'd like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.